So yeah, we've got a lovely trio of talks today from all reporting papers from a new special issue on everyday life in the pandemic. So we've got Mary Green with us today, who'll be giving an introduction to the Everyday Life in a Pandemic Consortium and also talking through a paper on the implications of COVID on time and temporal practices. We've then got Sigrid. No, is Sigrid next or are we next? Apologies. Sigrid's next, who will be also talking us through one of these projects and particularly focused around the issues of sustainable consumption, sustainable food practices. And then Ave, who will talk to us about the impacts of COVID on domestic spaces and the kind of impacts it's had on home work in the home office. So what we'll do format-wise is I will hand over to each speaker. I'll give you an introduction to each speaker before they begin presenting, but we'll save all the questions until the end of the talks. So prepare yourself, settle in. We're going to have a nice series of talks. Each speaker will have somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes to present their work, and then we'll have a collective discussion at the end, because I hope it will draw out some synergies between the work in a nice way. So Mary has jumped the gun nicely here and already has her slides to show, but as a quick introduction here, so Mary's an assistant professor in sociology in sustainable consumption at the Environmental Policy Group in Wageningen. So Mary, from my perspective, Mary's led my involvement in this project and introduced me to the Everyday Life in a Pandemic Consortium and has been instrumental in both seeing that consortium working together and arranging the special issue for us, as many others in the room have been involved in the editorial team and writing those papers too. So thank you, Mary, for getting me involved, if nothing more. So this paper is applying the sort of ideas from social practice theories to look at the impacts of COVID on temporal pattern and temporal experiences during the pandemic. So I'll not steal any more of Mary's thunder. I'll allow you to take over from there. And right. Mary, I'll do some frantic waving at you around the 20-minute mark so you don't overrun too much then.
Okay, great. Your head is right here on my screen, so I'll see that.
Over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for the introduction. As she said, I'm Mary Green and I'm based here at Wageningen University. I come from Ireland, as you might be able to hear, but I know most of you here in the crowd anyway, so I'll presenting here first on an overview of the consortium project and then around the paper on temporalities, as Claire nicely outlined. So Claire did a really good job in giving a brief overview of the project already, but I'm here representing a consortium of really excellent colleagues that we all came together at the beginning of the lockdown that we saw emerging around Europe and around the world in around March, April 2020. And this group of great colleagues kind of share an interest in understanding everyday life and the consumption practices that we engage in through these social practice theory frameworks. So we shared this theoretical starting point and we're interested in unpacking what the systemic disruption we were witnessing, what was going on with that and how it could be used as an empirical lens to say something about changing dynamics of social practices. So between us, we were affiliated or based across 11 different country contexts. So we used these affiliations as a basis for the methodological inquiry that we engaged in, which involved a shared methodology, qualitative methodology that involved investigating through interview-based methods as well as some photo journaling what was going on in people's everyday lives, with a goal to revealing something about the underlying dynamics that shape social practices and their arrangements in daily life. And so we have most of the countries based in Europe, but also an Asian perspective from China and Vietnam, and as well the United States. So central to the range of papers that are emerging in the special issue is this idea of using a social disruption, and particularly COVID as a systemic disruption that was being shared across many different places and contexts, and studying that as a way to better understand how dynamics of practices are held together, how trajectories of change play out, as well as what that might mean for efforts to intervene in social practices in the longer term. So we had a number of questions that underpinned the analysis. So the first was to look at how practices were changing, what new types of doing and their arrangements were emerging. And we were particularly interested in understanding socially differentiated dynamics. And because we were coming from a number of different country contexts as well, how this might vary culturally. And the point of all of this then was to say something more about how we could inform efforts to direct practices towards in line with achieving the goals of sustainability transitions. So adopting the shared practice framework, then we were interested specifically in looking at the institutional embedding of practices in these different contexts we were looking at. So how different COVID regimes interact then with the everyday doings and performances of individuals. And we looked across a range then of everyday practices and their intersections, such as work, mobilities, food practices, as well as other intersecting practices in domestic settings. So overall, we had about 250 participants take part across the country context, and the various researchers that were connected with those contexts led in terms of interviewing and doing contextual analysis of what was going on in terms of COVID regimes in those contexts. So we had country reports that were written up to kind of get a backdrop of what was happening across the different contexts in this period of the first lockdown. And we had the interview methods and then photojournals as well, which if people are interested, they can go to the website and have a look through some of those photojournals that are placed up there. So as Claire already outlined, this is culminating in the special issue that's emerging, and there's already 9 papers out already, part of this special issue, and there's about 3 more to emerge, including the introductory paper. And we've also had a few podcasts made with authors on the papers, so summing up their main ideas of their papers for a more diverse audience. And in terms of next steps, we're engaged in a bit of some second wave data collection now with a smaller set of cases to say something more about what's going on over the longer term with regards to the changing trajectories of practices. So that's a really quick synopsis then on the broader project. So now I'll move on to this paper. So this particular paper is exploring the undoing and reassembling of household practices by paying particular attention to dynamics of connectivity between practices, and in particular temporal connectivity. So practices can be held together in different ways, and we can look at different kind of dimensions of that, for example, held together in terms of spatialities or temporalities or a range of forms of connectivity. And in this paper, we really unpack the temporal dimensions. So adding to the kind of broader conceptual framing of the whole consortium, we unpacked a bit more what time means for consumption and for social practices in this paper. And we draw on some key thinking from Elizabeth Chove and Dale Southerton around how practices themselves constitute and produce temporalities in terms of how they're arranged together in sequences and coordinated in daily life. And we also draw on debates concerning the extent to which the institutions of society continue to shape the rhythms of personal lives and practices, and to what extent this influences in continued socially varied experiences of temporalities. So using then the empirical situation of the first lockdowns across Europe, we're particularly interested in saying something about how practice arrangement bundles become unsettled and destabilized, and how they're put back together in ways that shape temporal rhythms of daily life and opportunities for different ways of consuming. And so the purpose of all of this then was to reveal insights into dynamics of change that could potentially inform purposeful transformation. So this paper drew on data from 5 of the country cases. These countries were all based in Europe, so Ireland, UK, Norway, Germany, and Italy. And together that comprised 97 interviews, and some of these countries had used photo diaries, methods which don't feature in terms of images in the paper, but which we looked across when exploring the data. We sought to have the broader sampling strategy for the consortium had a shared approach in which we sought to look at diversity across a number of elements. So particularly household type, the presence or absence of children in the house, as well as the extent to which people were in work or out of work, or engaging in different kind of arrangements of work in the context of the lockdown. And we also had a spread across male and female categories, as well as life course stages. So moving on then to some of the findings emerging from the paper. So reflecting, I guess, the temporality of the process of moving through the first lockdown in Europe, the paper structures the analysis around how, first looking at how the disintegration of routines happened in the initial phases of the lockdown, and then how routines were restructured and rebundled across households in Europe. And the final category then looks at the implications of this for issues of consumption and sustainability. So this little nice graphic here was made by my colleague Emily Lang, who's really great. She's very creative and gives us a lot of help with visualizing our work. So first of all then, the first theme looks at how the disintegration of routines played out. And of course, sorry, I see a spelling mistake there, but across the sample, there was widespread breakdown of routinely organized practice bundles in people's daily lives. But this was experienced quite differently amongst the sample. And for some people, this brought like great ontological insecurity and unease. And for others, it was often framed as an opportunity and as a relief or a welcome intervention in the ongoing flow of daily life. And then for others, there was elements of both of this present. Closer investigation of this revealed that these differential experiences were often associated with how the intersection of institutional and personal temporalities were held together. And particularly we have people or practice arrangement bundles in daily life that were more enmeshed in institutional rhythms and roles, such as those associated with work or school before the lockdown, were more likely to report more impact and effectiveness through the disruption. So in particular, we saw families with working parents and young children really stressing, very disruptive events and conditions in light of the lockdown. And for a lot of these people, they found this very stressful. They wanted normality. They were feeling very worn out, and they wanted life back as it was before. That's not to say everyone in that situation was stressed out. There were some people who welcomed more time at home and so on. So this contrasted with people whose lives were maybe less enmeshed in institutional rhythms, before the lockdown. For example, older age participants who were retired, for example. So this quote is from a woman in Ireland who had retired a few years previously, and she talked about it being like a big holiday and how there was actually not that much change, but she felt less pressure to do things socially and so on. So there was quite different experiences, which we found to be an outcome of the intersection of institutional and personal temporalities. So yeah, following this, we saw widespread shared efforts across the sample to reorder daily life practices into new practice arrangement bundles. And we identified a number of strategies in which participants reported reconfiguring their routines. And so reflecting some of the concepts outlined by Southerton, we focused on how practices were resequenced and rescheduled, and the particular role of establishing anchor practices in the day around which hot and cold spells of practices could be arranged. And we also focused it, or another theme to emerge was how the process of restructuring and rescheduling routines often involved networked coordination and negotiation with other householders. So while a number of different anchors emerged, there was a surprising similarity across the cultural context in terms of how people were resetting anchors in their daily lives. And for most people, this involved things like meals, but also things like when they were working in the day. And these kind of anchor practices were kind of giving new meaning as a way to restructure the day. So for this student who's based in Norway, she talks about how meals had been quite insignificant before, especially the meals during the day, but they took on this new meaning as a point in the day around which other activities could be structured, and as a point for, engaging with other people in her household. We have this quote from a man in Ireland who talked about how the sometimes tense ways in which the rescheduling and recoordinating of routines played out, in which householders had to decide, what practices would be shared, what wouldn't, how these would play out in terms of the use of space in the room, and so on. So there was a quite, shared themes emerging across the sample in terms of these dynamics. So the final theme then that we unpack in the paper relates to issues regarding consumption and sustainability. And in particularly across the sample, we saw this, again, more or less widespread reflexivity in terms of participants reflecting on the time-space organization of their daily practices. And in particularly focusing on the role of institutional rhythms and work-related practices as having a kind of central role in organizing their days that they had a new awareness around. So many people felt they less harried tempo to their daily lives. There was differentiation across the sample in relation to that, as we already unpacked. But overall, people did feel that having space to rearrange their routines offered opportunities. So we have forms of recruitments to new practices, and people mentioned like taking up things like food growing, also like ordering food box schemes to their house, engaging in more time with children during periods where they might usually be commuting, and so on. So this is an example of a quote from a woman in Ireland, again, who spoke about, reflecting on how much of her pre-pandemic work travel was unnecessary, and the free time in her day that has now emerged to enable her to make some big changes, like ordering a box scheme, cooking more locally, and planting veg, spending more time with her daughter, and so on. So in the discussion then, we tried to unpack a bit more about what all of this means for sustainable consumption research and policy. So we argue that, yes, studying changing dynamics of everyday life during this moment of disruption enable us to say something more about underlying dynamics of temporal connectivity between practices and the implications of this for arranging and structuring consumption in daily life. So as I outlined, there were heterogeneous experiences, but surprising similarity across cultural contexts, which revealed that categories of social difference that are more shaped by perhaps the institutional embedding of lives were more significant in terms of differentiating experiences than, for example, cultural contexts. The role of workplaces in particular is time ordering institutions that shape entrenched connections between practices and reproduce various forms of consumption was a very strong theme to emerge, as well as the socially varied capacities of people to reorganize and experiment with new arrangements, depending on the degree of the institutional embedding of their lives. We outlined some areas for further research, such as the need for more longitudinal work, the need for work across cultural contexts, specifically to say something more about when culture does play a more significant role. For example, does the role of culture become more significant over longer term periods, or they were all European countries, so taking more regional or other contexts into account as well, and then more work on the role of work and its particular role in structuring practices at home. So yeah, so that was a very quick synopsis of the paper, and that's the reference there. So for anybody who's interested in reading further, the team included Arve, who's here, Claire, Elizabeth, and Lorenzo as well, who I think I saw here as well. So they can all chime in the discussion too, hopefully. And just to say, they're an absolutely great bunch of people to work with. So thank you for that. And yeah, thanks everybody. So I'll hand back to Claire now.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for the emergency services keeping you beautifully to time there. I just heard the sirens explode in the background.
Oh, sorry, yeah. What's going on here? Great.
Thank you. That was a fabulous and lovely, thorough summary of that paper. I really appreciate that. So maybe if you can take your slides down, and Sigrid, if you can begin to share yours. Just a welcome to everyone that's joined us in the meantime. What we're going to do, so the format of this one is we've got three speakers, each talking about different aspects of how COVID-19 affected everyday life. So we're going to hear from the three speakers and then have a kind of collective discussion at the end. So we pass now on to Sigrid, who will share her slides.
I can't share.
You can't share. Why not?
That is really strange.
Oh, try again now. So if you close anything to do with sharing that you had open and then try again, it might just be that there was a bit of overlap between yours and Mary's. It should work now.
Okay, I will do again. No, I'm not allowed to share. I'm sorry. I don't know why.
1 second. And how about now? This is interesting. You were able to share earlier, weren't you?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't share at all.
Or maybe send it to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it's handy and you can email it to me, I can.
Yeah, I can email it now, but I think it's heavy, but I will email it to you now, Claire, and then you can share it because I can't. This is very strange. I don't know why. Let me exit full screen. Maybe then Arve can go first.
Well, that would be the other option, Sigrid. Do you want me to hand over to Arve and then we'll come back to you and try again?
That makes sense. Yeah, maybe Sigrid can reboot. Sometimes that helps.
Let's try that. No, Stephen, we're not there yet. This is nowhere close to the level of carnage from the last seminar. Okay, then Arve, would you be happy to speak next? Have you got your slides ready to share?
Sure, they should be ready. Second.
Yeah.
how's that?
Perfect. Okay, so Arve Hansen joins us from the University of Oslo and is a human geographer and researcher in the Centre for Development and Environment, where he leads a research group on sustainable consumption and energy equity. Today, he's going to be talking to us about the kind of experience of working from home during COVID-19 and the impacts that that had on boundaries in the home and thinking about the home as an office. So Arve, I'll hand over to you without further ado. And as for Mary, should you overrun, you'll see me frantically waving in the corner of your screen.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm happy to be here to present this. So this is another one of the wonderful teams that I was involved in this as part of this project. This one with Ulrike Vettal, Catherine Ellsworth-Krebs, Sejal Chenjiri, and Gert Spargan. And well, I'm here for the gender balance. So I'm the third author of this piece. But yes, reworking boundaries in the home as office, boundary traffic during COVID-19 lockdown, the future of working from home. This was based, or Team Norway, based at Centre for Development and Environment here at the University of Oslo, and funded by Include, which is a center within the center, Research Center for Social Inclusive Energy Transition, just to mention that. Let's see if I can make this work. Yeah. So Mary has already mentioned the projects. I will not say anything more about that. For this specific paper, we focused on, or we used data from the UK, Norway, and the US. And there's the paper as well, just out last week. It's nice to see it there. And well, the starting point for this and the focus on the home as office is that working from home has been, oh, there's some noise there. Working from home has been, of course, discussed a lot also before the pandemic. It's been hailed for its potential environmental benefits, for its positive effects on potentially positive effects on job satisfaction and on work-life balance. Now, since the pandemic and the following lockdown regimes forced so many of us into working from home, we found this a highly interesting case for studying practice change. And this is also something that was raised by so many of our participants. So that's the starting point for focusing on working from home. So we draw on 17 UK interviews, 11 US interviews, 28 Norway interviews. And here's a figure from the paper showing the employment situation of our participants. So the majority working from home, while some were continued doing regular work, and some were partially working from home, and a few were not working at all. Theoretically, we draw on boundary theory and teleworking literature, but use mainly a social practice approach, like the other papers in this special issue as well. I will not comment on that further here, but rather get straight to our empirical data, I think. So the first thing we cover in the paper is the participants' experiences with working from home. And they were highly varied across national contexts, but also within them. And I will get back to some of these inequalities that were embedded in this. But some had quite pleasant experiences. This is at an early stage of the pandemic, you should say. But like Ashley in the US, I found that it's been really special because she would work so much, and she would still work a lot at home, but now she could at least see her kids and her husband, and usually she would never be able to do that at that time of year. And also Lars in Norway, who says that he's been able to do other things, for example, attend seminars and things that are not necessarily directly work related, but that he found useful, and stuff that would probably never happen otherwise, as he says, because he could not do it at the office or in an open office space. But it brought along intense amounts of what we call boundary traffic here, and I'm sure many of you can recognize this. So we draw on the concept of boundary work from boundary theory, basically referring to dealing with all kinds of boundaries in everyday life. But then we add the concept of boundary traffic, which is our concept, to try to better grasp the often sort of complex collision of practices that were caused by working from home. And this figure here from the paper summarizes the practices that our participants talked about. And there was this feeling of intense overload of different practices. And this was especially strong for those with children while schools and kindergartens were closed. So caring for and playing with younger children was one of them, but it also continued after that. So, you know, involving cooking, dishwashing, laundering, leisuring, cleaning, staying fit, but also improving digital competencies and office making, homemaking, as I will return to this office making part later. And, you know, just a funny example here from Lisa in Norway says that, you know, her kid who was usually in kindergarten, and she was at Teams meeting and just saw him running around naked in the garden. And there was still snow at the time. That happened twice. And also, I think this paper is interesting, has been interesting to me in many ways, also because of this intense meta feeling of doing this, being stuck in the home office, writing about, and with intense boundary traffic, writing about boundary traffic. And up in the right corner, that's my oldest daughter at the time. So screenshots from a snap saying home office summarized in Norwegian. And I honestly still get exhausted just thinking about these past few years. Anyways, lockdown, of course, brought disruption in many ways, and as Mary has already touched upon, required different forms of rebundling of everyday practices. And here again, embedding homeschooling into work practices was seen as a major challenge. And again, the experiences were highly different, and also so this Lisa in Norway up in the right corner here, pointing also towards some of the gender differences perhaps in this working from home. So she talked about how her husband would usually spend time in his writing room. So to him, there was not that big of a change, but she and several of the women participants reported this. She sort of felt the need to know that her children were doing well. So therefore, she sort of rather accepted the noise and sat where her children were. She sat at the kitchen table where all of her 3 children were. And also some of the negotiations here, such as Martha in Norway here says that she chose not to bring sort of proper equipment into the house, and this was sort of a way to keep work out of the home when possible. But a range of different practices were integrated into the workday, of course. And many had the feeling of not really being present anywhere. Like Siri here, who says that, you know, you do several things at the same time, and you listen in on a meeting, check something else, and wash clothes. And she said it's probably not so wise in the long run. But I can assure you it's not necessarily a female thing, as she has said, because at least I can recognize this. And all the extra work of cleaning and keeping tidy in the home was in one sense could be said to be, it was experienced as productive work since it needed to be done anyway, sort of, but it was also stressful, and it was seen as often necessary because it was often experienced to be difficult to work in a messy space. And of course, the home office also created mess. So Olivia in the UK here says that doing laundry and dishes is something to do, but also because she was there all day and wanted it to be tidy. We then also zoom in on digitalization in the paper, both in terms of the competences needed to handle that, like Claire in the UK, not you, Claire. She said she had never even heard about Zoom before and didn't know how to use it, so she had to acquire a lot of new skills. And then again, you know, the highly different ways in which this working from home situation was experienced. Some, like Mohammed here in the UK, feeling this kind of surge in productivity, could get so much work done when there were fewer breaks and fewer disturbances. But then others, like Nora here in Norway, who said that things just really slipped. And I believe she was working on her PhD thesis. And there was this kind of feeling that you sit at the same table having breakfast, lunch, and work, and having dinner, as she says. So then she didn't get this kind of spatial organization in her everyday life that could tell her like I was doing work during that same time of the day, and many had similar experiences. And finally, we also looked at what we call office making. This figure here shows that some of the US households already had home offices before the pandemic, while the Europeans one did not. And the Norwegians were very likely to work in multifunctional spaces and using sort of existing household materials. We see some examples here in the pictures. And it took, this office making took many different shapes, of course. Generally involved a spatial reorganization of the home, and also required new materials. So like Michael here in the US saying that he needed a bigger screen and a bigger desk, and so it says hashtag first world problems, but in my work I can't do it on a tiny laptop screen. And of course, this is something that I believe if we look further on in the lockdown as well, in the pandemic, we would see a lot more of this kind of equipment and of acquiring more equipment and of setting up offices. And this is something that, for example, Catherine has looked at in different papers as well, which comes with sustainability implications, of course, and comes with sustainability implications if you have twice the equipment basically at the office and at home. And this is also somewhere where we diverge from much existing literature. There is this sense of working from home from the existing literature, meaning that you can work anywhere at any time. While we quite clearly see from this study that you depend on your material arrangements, even if you're working from home, and that it takes highly different shapes depending on material arrangements. And then finally, we try to reflect upon what this means for the future of work. Obviously, this de-Britanization of practices has led to reflections over existing organization of everyday life. Many, and again, this is an early point of the pandemic, but at least many said that they want to keep the time and flexibility offered by home offices, and this has been also supported by service and so on. And I know in Norway now, many offices have strategies for getting people to get back to the office, but it depends a lot on the material arrangements and the houses people live in, basically, and the room they have available and so on. And this kind of massive reskilling that we've seen during the pandemic has demonstrated what is possible to do from home. Of course, we know now there's a lot of possibility there, but also a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the future of work looks like. And we've seen that the pandemic and the working from home has altered sort of the boundaries between home and work, and that's both within the home space and beyond. There's given new meanings to home spaces, and of course, basically work being with us all the time. I think for many of our participants as well, there's this experience of both, work coming into your home in a whole new way, but also then your home getting into your work in a whole new ways, right? And we see, and this is also something for the future of work, that of course working from home makes spatial inequalities more pronounced. And if we were to implement working from home regimes in the longer term, it would have highly unequal effects. And of course also there was also the inequality during the pandemic for the many who couldn't work from home and had to go to the work or were furloughed. And we, of course, we are not necessarily very optimistic about the sustainability implications of working from home. There are the potentials for the improvements of work-life balance, but there's also the opposites because of these collisions. And in terms of sustainability, there is of course also the potential in terms of in terms of traffic and so on. But also, as we see, the massive material footprints of all these offices is also something to keep in mind. And we also reflect a bit on the potential rebound effects that this has in terms of releasing other forms of consumption. All right, that's it, more or less on time.
More or less. Thank you very much, Ave. That was fascinating. And this is a brand spanking new paper, right? Just published this week. So would you like to just pop the link to that in the chat as you find it?
I'll do that. Yes, thank you.
Peruse at their leisure. And now without ado, we'll hand over to Sigrid. Fab. And if you want to try again sharing your screen, Sigrid, and Ave, if you could stop sharing yours.
Oh, yes.
Fabulous.
I think you can see my screen now, yeah?
Perfect. Yes, we can. So it's currently on the kind of standard landing page, which is absolutely fine, but it's not.
No. I will change, but I'm just working on my small laptop, so I need to rearrange.
Immediately demonstrating Ave's points there.
Absolutely.
Fabulous. So Sigrid joined us as a professor of food and healthy living based in Aarhus University. Correct me if I'm wrong on the pronunciation of that, Sigrid. Aarhus University of Applied Science, and also a research fellow in the environmental policy group at Wageningen. Sigrid's a researcher in consumption sociology with an interest in sustainable food and food security, and unsurprisingly, therefore, is going to be presenting a paper on food practices during the pandemic. Thanks, Sigrid. I'll hand straight over to you.
Yes, thanks, Claire. Yeah, and actually, I'm no longer a fellow at Wageningen anymore, but I'm a real colleague of Mary now at environmental policy as an associate professor. But that doesn't really matter. But anyway, yes, I'm very happy to introduce you to our food work. And for all of you, there are several people also involved now in this seminar, amongst others, Claire, who is the first author of this paper. So also Claire, chip in later if you want to in the discussion, and also maybe from Martina and others. And yes, so without further ado, I will go to the presentation. Yeah, this is about food practices. It's again in the same consortium as the paper that Mary presented in Arve. Mary has already elaborated on the consortium, so I won't go into that there. but we zoom in particularly on food practices. And this paper has been published already early this year. It's about COVID-19 and social material bounded experimentation in food practices. It's a mouthful, but I will try to unpack it a little bit step by step. So, like already Mary delineated in the introduction of the whole consortium, it is about social disruption as opportunity for change. So we really wanted to go into these lived experiences in these daily routines, in which also the temporalities that also Mary and also Arva touched upon play in, but also see to what extent that relates to reflexive, but also unreflexive change in doings in an everyday life perspective. And in doing so, we indeed took the pandemic as quite a unique opportunity, I have to say, because we know that if we disrupt something, people might consider change, but that we have at the same time disruptions in system of provisions, as well as disruptions in the lifestyles of people, like also delineated on the relation between, for instance, working from home and having home practices of cleaning, but also with food, at such a large scale is unique. I can't recall that we had it at the same time that, for instance, on the food domain, all our practices of shopping were disruptive. Maybe we should go less often, maybe different times of the day, but also the way how we shop was really disrupted, as well as when we shop for food was also really disrupted, because maybe the work-home commute has been disrupted. So we really looked at the intersection between disrupted systems of provisions and disruptive lifestyles in looking at food shopping and eating, and mostly eating, of course, at home, replacing also maybe for eating out. The research questions that we particularly were looking at is indeed related to the larger project again. How are everyday food practices changing in response to the COVID pandemic restrictive measures? So there were clear restrictions on what people could and were allowed to do. Then what new practices did we see emerging? But also, how do they then result in kind of socially differentiated practice performances across context and also across livelihoods of people? We had, of course, the same group of respondents as was already presented also by Mary, in differentiation in age groups, but also differentiation in living together with families or living in cities with a garden or in apartments, etc. So we also had the same criteria of inclusion for this study. And ultimately, we try to have a small peek towards, okay, what might this study then mean in terms of how practices might stick in the future, and also what can it learn us to inform also policies to advance more sustainable behavior in food practices. This study builds on data from 7 countries. So we had in total 11 countries, but the food practices study was based on 7 countries, 6 in the EU, and we included also a study from Vietnam. Again, also, like Mary already showed it, we picturing life in a pandemic was really useful in our cross-comparative, cross-contextual comparison, in understanding also the writings about the practices from the interviews, with having some visuals and ideas on what it might look like. Also, this was mainly used also for us as researchers to understand each other's context in order to be able to also analyze the data collectively. So looking at cross-contextual similarities and differences, and now really going into the context and the content of our project, actually, it was not so much about cross-contextual similarities and differences, but what we actually really saw is that there are similarities and differences within context. So we saw similar patternedness in the different contexts, even when we consider a European and a more Asian context. And I will show this a little bit. So we focus then within all these countries, how practices become then discontinued and how they are reconfigured in the event of a shock. First of all, it's quite similar, so I won't go in a lot of detail. It's about breaking daily routines. So to know how to do things that are actually unreflexively being performed on a daily basis, about, for instance, the workshop commute, really reconfigured in eating behind a computer, not even getting dressed for getting to work. So we saw here where really well-established routines were broken on both sides of the system of provision, as well as in lifestyle changes. And within that breaking of linkages between different bundled practices, so to say, we saw also that new notions of risk and hygiene definitely played in. They produce a kind of friction for the way we were used to do things before. And a very good example is, of course, shopping, for instance, in supermarkets. This is not as easy. You can't just simply pop in. You have to make sure you've got your mask. You have to wear your gloves. You have to think about a time that is maybe more quiet. So this quote also really illustrates that this kind of new health risk society definitely complicates matters, and also requires a kind of reflexive behavior on taken for granted previously routines. Another way that we saw that practices are then reconfiguring is that if the practices are being broken, and the ways that you actually routinely enact shopping for food on a daily basis, and you maybe can only allow yourself to go once a week to the store, there are kind of new ways of looking at food provisioning, also from stocking and storing food. So people became more aware of what they still had in their cabinets, in their fridges, and actually were planning also their food purchasing and their food consumption a bit more. People became more aware of the foods they had still at home and how to use up foods, but also that related to buying different types of foods as well. So we saw more, for instance, more canned tomatoes being purchased because they can easily combine and they have a long shelf life. Then we see also that the ideas of reconstructing healthy and comfortable lives had two different ways in which they were being performed. On one way, we saw that healthy eating became much more prominent. People were much more reflexive on their own agency in staying healthy. This is a quote from Vietnam, but actually we saw similarities across the different countries. But here, a young person says, "We students didn't care about health, but since the COVID-19 pandemic, we started to eat better." So we are knowledgeable, or we become aware of our own role and responsibility in staying healthy. But we, on the other hand, also saw that, this whole idea of healthy and comfortable lives really resonated also in having comfort food. So food practices were not only considered as maintaining health, but also being comfortable and providing rhythm in everyday life. So food became this anchor point in family life. Okay, I'm working from home, but then we have lunch and we have dinner, but also compensating for activities of going out through having nicer foods at home for snacking, but also that people reported from, now I work so close to the fridge, I snack much more. So you see that food actually starts to accommodate different aspects of everyday life. And this also relates to how food practices are actually being relocated, literally also within the home. So we see also that here, this quote really exemplifies that since we couldn't go out, we made nice food here at home and dressed up a little bit to have an evening out, making a special evening out. So you can't go having your Friday night, drinks with your friends. So you need to make something special at home to compensate for the loss of these type of activities, and it often also involves food. And also we see that, for instance, a quote from Italy, we have a small terrace that we hardly ever use. They mostly use it in this quote for hanging up the laundry to dry, but now they rediscovered that little terrace to have breakfast, and also creating certain spaces within the home for having special dinners. So food actually also meant that this created newly performed activities of going out, eating out, and also new ways of utilizing space within the home. So it has a real important meaning in compensating for a lot of different activities that are normally performed elsewhere or on other moments. And then this also led to the reconfiguration in practices in relation to culinary experimentation. So we see that a lot of people were baking cakes and trying out different types of cuisines, like this quote illustrates. We all baked hundreds of cakes, and we tried cuisines of the thousands of nationality and a lot of experimentation. But also this was facilitated, this experimentation in culinary appreciation, not only through cooking, but also through the material infrastructures that were utilized in a more intense way, that, for instance, home food delivery apps already existed, but now really were stimulated by massive use of them, by ordering foods. And in this quote, it's even sometimes like 3 times a day. But we saw also that existing material infrastructures were utilized more intensively, and also related to new practice configurations at home, with food at home. So having showed a little bit of the similar developments in breaking and remaking practices related to food consumption across the different contexts, it is really important to also illustrate how socially differentiation was not so much related to the different country context and the different stages maybe, or the different stringencies in pandemic measures, but we saw that the differences in performativity in practices and the way people are enabled or disabled in performing certain practices, which we call bounded experimentation, was mostly related to groups within society. So we saw definitely social differentiation within the different countries. And here I show in this slide 2 quotes from Vietnam and 2 quotes from the Netherlands that actually clearly highlight that this bounded experimentation is related to different social groups. So let's first have a look at Vietnam, where someone says, "We have not eaten on time and together since I lost my job. My husband and I now have to go out for food. When we have to now go out for work whenever people need us for some errands to run. My mother-in-law takes care of the children." So this quote clearly illustrates that some people really had to deal in their everyday life with a loss of job, having no money, and just had absolutely no time to experiment with baking cakes, etc. And a similar quote we have actually from the Netherlands, where the top quote is, "I didn't understand all those people that started baking and cooking. I was busier than ever. We had to reinvent education for small children. I was working day and night." So here you see how jobs actually led to bounded experimentation with all this kind of culinary explorations, etc. People didn't have the time. So time was definitely a limiting factor in experimentation in food practices. On the other hand, we see in both countries how people really reconfigured their practices because they were in different conditions. So here there is someone who says, normally in Vietnam, normally I eat out in the streets. During the lockdown, I could not go out. My neighbors and I cook and eat together. We contribute money, assign who goes shopping and who cooks, and then we enjoy eating together. So here's a moment of also enjoyment, how food actually reconnects people together, and how people spend time in really cooking themselves and also sharing food. And a similar quote also from the Netherlands illustrates, "My son-in-law, who's a vegan, came to live with me together with my daughter and a 3-year-old. And this woman clearly explains that she starts to experiment with vegan cooking." So what this said is actually that the abilities of people to reconfigure their practices is related also importantly to having time at hand and having infrastructures at hand, and how people are actually experiences also their social life in different ways. So, and I think this is really important, as when we consider changing practices for societal betterment of our improving sustainability transformations, we need to take this into account, that there is no single solution fits all. And I think this is what the COVID pandemic has clearly illustrated, how similar disruptions can have really different differentiated outcomes. So what does this then mean for lessons for advancing sustainable food consumption? And I think this is a far stretch, because the research that we conducted was in the early days of the pandemic. So we examined change in practices as a direct consequence of government action. So there might also be, one can wonder whether it's a coping strategy, a temporary coping strategy, and that people are bouncing back to normal, or that it might be lasting. At this moment, we don't know. And we also can't easily conclude what is more or less sustainable, because that's not what the research is about, although it is really important to understand how we might enable change also with a kind of purposeful direction in terms of sustainability. It is a bit early to conclude on lasting sustainability change. However, we may indicate seeds for change. And this is also relating to the importance of following up this research and this whole consortium research on a longitudinal project. Mary already touched base on that we are looking at from that perspective into Ireland, Norway, and the Netherlands, but also from an Asian perspective, we have now we have now some ideas on how to advance this. We have a study in China, and we are also trying to incorporate this now in a study in Vietnam to see how do pre-pandemic practices, so how did they change in the early pandemic stage. This has been covered by the consortium, but now we are redoing it again to look at what are then the practices, how are they being performed in the late pandemic, and do we then again see change, to also be able to see if change is sustaining from pre-pandemic to late pandemic, and what is then making that some aspects sustain and some actually bounce back to normal or change again in another way. So I think this is really critical that we now follow up on this early pandemic research, because we saw a host of literature coming out on the pandemic. But I think if we want to understand how practices might change over time and how we might inform lasting change, and this is really crucial. So last but not least, I'm very grateful to this whole consortium, and it was really inspiring and great to work with this whole group of authors on this food paper, but also in having this wider iterations within the consortium on thinking about disruption and change over time. So I will leave it here.
Thank you ever so much, Sigrid. And again, lovely timekeeping. So at this point, we move on to our discussions, and you are very welcome to either raise a hand and speak yourself, or if you need me to ask a question on your behalf, you're most welcome to pop it in the chat and just flag it to me there, and I can speak for you if you are busy or away from your microphone. Any volunteers for a first hand? I've seen 2 go up and 2 vanish. Martina, did you have a hand?
It was a clapping, but
a clapping hand and a waving hand.
But I can just as well ask a question.
Please
I don't know,
do.
can you see me? Because he's telling me that he cannot show my video right now.
Cannot see you, which is strange because I could before.
Yeah, strange.
But we can hear you, so maybe proceed with your question.
It's this technology always. Still, one question to the temporality, because you had 2 examples there of people. Once the people who were very stressed due to home schooling and homework, and the other ones who felt like holidays, which was a retired couple, which of course inclines a little that those people who were very dependent on institutions and had a very tough schedule, they were affected more by having to reorder their temporalities than those that from already were living in a kind of situation where they were not, stuck in a very rigid schedule and dependent on institutions. So did you look more systematically at the differences between those people who, with children, without children, with work, without work?
Across our sample, did we look more systematically at those differences? Yeah. Yeah, we did. We looked across like instances across the 5 countries that we had, and yeah, there were pretty stark differences that, you know, led us to produce this as a theme around the intersection of the institutional and personal rhythms in daily life. So yeah, in doing that, we had created like an Excel sheet where we went across the different country contexts and entered the quotes and so on. There were deviant situations, of course, like for example, some families that had young kids were reporting more positive experiences in that they thought that they had more time to be with their kids, or so I think it also depended on the nature of people's work and the extent, so the type of job, for example. But overall, these were kind of structural differences, I think, emerged quite strong.
Thank you very much. Anyone else with a question? So I'm going to use chair's privilege if no one peeps up soon. Oh, go on, Stephen. We'll save everyone from the sound of my voice for a moment.
Hi, thanks so much for the great presentations. It's good to get an update on this work. I remember participating in a session last summer, I think on some of the early stages, so it's good to see this all being published. I really like the thinking about temporality and the notion of time and how our working lives and home lives are changing and what the sustainability implications for that are. Here's some typing going on there.
Sorry.
I think I wondered if you found in your interviews and things if some of this sort of kind of a feeling around the notion of work and work as it has been in the past as a sort of this daily grind that doesn't give us any satisfaction. This sort of sentiment, I think, is kind of captured a lot nowadays in sort of anti-work kind of movements or sentiment in societies. And also at the same time, of course, alongside that, there's this sort of push in sustainability literature around the need to sort of reduce work, or, you know, around 4-day work weeks, and how this sort of approach then links up to sustainability and just the reduction in overall consumption and these kinds of things. And I wondered, you know, I saw a lot of interesting examples where, you know, some folks were very productive at home because now they had this sort of, they had no distractions. But if there was a sort of this sort of sentiment of maybe rethinking why we're working so much in the first place, and how that sort of kind of feeling might have sort of reverberated into the creation of meaning behind you know, working from home and sort of managing a family and a household.
So that was partly to the working from home paper and the temporal.
Sure. Yeah, for anybody. Yeah.
Well, I'm part of both of those papers. I can, but I at the top of my head, I can't remember now if we had much discussion of work per se. What I do remember was much discussion about having these packed schedules, both work and everything else, right? So so many, and then so Mary mentioned that there were some positive experiences with this, and there were families who reported on this, and it will be interesting to see if we can do a follow-up with them to see if they actually managed to keep their schedules relaxed after. My guess would be that we did not, right? So we sort of fall back into the same kind of temporal traps. But yeah, definitely children, families with smaller children, many of them reported this, or some of them reported this a nice experience of less harriedness. But that was not necessarily just work, it was also the commute between work and home, but also then all the after work activities for their children, especially. So their children would be home instead of like running in between all kinds of activities.
Yeah, I think, yeah, to add to that, like we do unpack a little bit in the time paper around, you know, the role of workplaces and institutions as time ordering institutions that, you know, have a very significant role in structuring, you know, arrangements of practices in people's daily lives, and that more attention needs to be focused on that in terms of the centrality of these institutions in ordering rhythms and practices in daily lives. Of course, there's room for agency in terms of within that, but that I think more work needs to be done. I know that you, Martina, have done a little bit of work around workplaces, haven't you? And, you know, the relationship between work and domestic consumption. And as you say, there are all these calls for like 4-day working weeks and so on. But I think what we found in the paper was that it's, you know, opportunities for sustainable consumption lie in particularly favourable arrangements of practices that provide room for organising daily life in a way that facilitates certain practices that are deemed important for more sustainable consumption, I guess. Yeah. So, thanks.
Thank you. And we have a question from Maury.
May I still respond?
Oh, sorry, Sigrid. Yes, of course.
Yeah, so because I very much appreciate the question of Stephen, and I think it is really, really important. And I'm just not referring to a paper, but just in general with follow-up studies, where we are now trying to uncover also to what extent reflexivity in a certain practice might be induced also by this kind of different experience of time, because I think people have experienced time a little bit different, and to what extent, if people are, and when the lockdown is lifted, they automatically return to other kind of temporal schemes, and to what extent then reflexivity might still lead to lasting change, or whether, yes, in practices, or whether people just automatically are, by actually this experience of time and temporalities, go into different patternedness. And this is something that we are looking at, especially also now in China data, to uncover that. What is then the role of reflexivity in relation to temporalities and certain specific practices, and how they are being bundled or not. And I think that is interesting also for seeking levers for change on the long run. So I think this is so important, and it relates also to what Mary says on the role of institutions, but also I think how people experience time and are certainly also reflexive on time. So yeah, I think this is important.
Just a short remark, is this not again a rather individualized perspective then, going away from practice thinking?
No, why?
Yeah, the individual perception and individual, that's how I
No, from a practice perspective, we just look at how within practices certain reflexivity is playing in there, or to what extent it is wider societal temporal dynamics. So I think it is sufficiently practice theoretical founded and not on individual.
Thank you. And over to Maury.
Okay, can you hear me, Claire?
Yeah, just about.
Okay, let me try to get a little bit closer.
Perfect.
So I'd like to ask, I've been working with these papers for quite some time and really appreciate the wonderful effort and creativity that they contain. But I wanted to ask a question that sort of goes beyond sort of methodological considerations and kind of crowdsources the expertise of this distinguished group about the future of work and what the sort of potential weak signals coming out of these excellent papers might be able to tell us. And whether we really are perhaps standing on the cliff edge of an epochal transition in the organization of work and by extension, the organization of consumption. And I'm sort of motivated by, I've been sort of struck by the kind of timidness of firms and managers and HR departments in requiring people to come back to work. Certainly the situation in the United States in many cases is that the pandemic is sort of stretched on and on and on. And I think it would have been unbelievable 2 years ago to think that the negotiating position of employees would be as strong as it has apparently become. Whether we're sort of looking at a situation which is really kind of back to the future of sizable portions of the population working from home on a significant or almost entire basis, and that some of the work being reported in these papers gives us any hints as to how the future is going to unfold over the next, say, decade or two.
Fabulous. So that's a question for all speakers. Does anyone want to speak first?
Yeah.
Or Mary?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting one, just reflecting, currently about what's even happening in our own workplace here, and there's a strong effort to try and bring us all back to the office. But as you say, there's room for negotiation there. And I think the expectations are half time in the office and half time to be at home. But yeah, and there's, different, reasons given, like the need for an academic culture, the need for the kind of more spontaneous in-person encounters and so on, and various strategies to try and get us all back in here. But I think it's a really interesting area of work that I think needs more focus in terms of looking at these longitudinal dynamics and what's happening, and also, moving beyond householders to look at, how managers and so on are, the actors in kind of systems of provision as well are responding to this, which I think is also part of what we've been intending for the longitudinal work, to look at actors beyond households as well, to explore, what kind of changes in the systems of provision need to be made to support lock-in of various practice trajectories. I guess the problems with that is there are problems with that in that, we're coming at this with a specific lens to look at daily consumption practices, whereas other people have different priorities and starting points. So it's like how to reach a shared vision on that, and then how to support longitudinal work in these important areas, I think is something that needs more attention.
And what amazes me actually is that the lockdown has been so long that we have actually established a kind of routine in working from home. And now suddenly that is lifted, and now we have two actually conflicting routines, working in the office and working from home, and they don't go well together. And that's what we all experience, because we were extremely effective, and this has been across different sectors, by having back-to-back meetings online. Now suddenly we have to do also live. We are partly in the office, partly outside the office, and when do we then get together? Because the reason is getting together, but not at the same time. So I think it is a very early stage to see how two different ways of working actually now collide, and it will be interesting to see how that sustains over time, because I only hear everyone is struggling. Doesn't matter from what sector, if it's the health sector, it's the academics, or it's people within education, or there are just a few sectors that were either closed and are now open, but most sectors have been dealing differently. So I think that is also, that will be important to follow that a little bit. I think it's rather early indeed to say something about it, but I find it fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and I think we're probably in a sort of moment of negotiation right now, right? Like in a quite important moment, I think. I think it partly depends on how employers go about in their strategies. If I can picture at least firms, if they suddenly realize that they can save so much money on just reducing drastically the number of office space, for example. But I think, and this is sort of going beyond the paper and rather experienced here in Norway now, I think it's sort of split. So partly, I think it's surprising the extent to which we've come back to the office. But then also we see that there is this desire to keep the home office as an option. And I think, you know, it's interesting to see the kind of traces that it leaves in a lot of different aspects. So, for example, if you look for houses, apartments in Oslo now, there will be a picture of the possibility of turning one of the rooms into an office, and this is, you know, stuff that we didn't see before. There's also been quite a significant movement out of Oslo, not in total, and I think it's been partly reversed, but at least more than before. There's been some massive urbanization in Oslo for a very long time, and there have been some changes in those movements, and that is because of the possibility of continuing working from home. And I think everyone expects that now, to have that possibility, although it does lead to some challenges, as Sigrid points out. But I think it's very interesting to see this kind of, from our research in for these papers, or in this consortium. I think there has been a lot of these different sort of moments or these experiences of these possibilities emerging or becoming clearer to our participants and to people. So, for example, online shopping, which many of our participants explained as sort of this moment that they suddenly they sort of stepped over to that side and they realized how easy it was to shop online. And I think working from home and using digital tools is also one of those experiences. And but now, yeah, it's also doing seminars like this, but in the office. So there's a lot more digitalization that also involves working from the office. So, wow,
you know, Arve and others, what I was thinking about is that we have a group of students who started to live on themselves during a pandemic and became used to utilizing all these online systems. And also, for instance, I was really intrigued with food. They order everything online. So they grew up to become independent from their parents in a pandemic time. And I'm really curious how this kind of large group of citizens is taking that on a longer term. I find that also really, really intriguing, because it's almost like more than 2 years that people grew up under those conditions.
I would like to do a big digitalization project as well. We're looking at both the consumption end, but also the labor end, and well, there's so many interesting things to do from that. I think also the energy requirement and the links to all kinds of different things.
I'm just seeing Maury's comment, which is not dissimilar to what I was going to say. I think the kind of house price conversation about where prices have gone up and where it's gone down, and actually reflecting across the speakers here, if I may, I think what's really interesting about this is the kind of the range of different methods that are now available to think about this change relative to when we were conducting this research at the time, and there was very little to know about what impact the pandemic was having, and we were speaking to people as the main way of getting this information. Now we've got all sorts of big data, market data, different ways of sort of tracking trends and thinking about the changes that have been had. I'm going to close as we are rapidly running out of time, and I'm very conscious that a couple of our speakers need to rattle off to their next meetings immediately.
We're running out of audience as well.
Running out of audience.
We'd just like to say a big thank you to Maury for all of your work supporting us all through this process, and your very detailed fine reading of everything and support throughout the way. So thank you, Maury.
I'm very glad you could join us in this session, though.
Yeah.
It's a little early in the day, but I look forward especially here to the summarizing paper.